overreach, global backlash. Today, I'm here to tell you, China's collapse is far worse than you think. Throughout history, we've seen patterns, predictable arcs that major powers follow as they rise and fall. These patterns are not random. They're the result of deeply rooted forces, economic, political, social, that evolve over long periods. When we zoom out and study centuries rather than years, we begin to see that countries, like people, go through life cycles. They are born, they grow strong, they reach a peak, and eventually they decline. What's happening in China right now must be seen through this lens. At the heart of this is the relationship between productivity, debt, internal cohesion, and external competitiveness. In the early stages of a country's ascent, productivity is the primary driver of growth. Institutions are young but adaptive, and there's a strong collective sense of purpose. In this phase, the country typically has low levels of debt, and its people work hard, save aggressively, and invest in building infrastructure and industries. It's a phase of dynamism and optimism. Then comes the next phase, when success starts to build upon itself. The country becomes wealthier, more urbanized, and more globally integrated. As incomes rise, so does borrowing. The financial system expands, often faster than regulation can keep up. This is the phase where debt begins to replace productivity as the main engine of growth. Credit becomes abundant, and in the short term, this fuels asset booms, especially in housing and real estate. It feels good while it lasts, but it's not sustainable. Eventually, the debt burden reaches a point where it begins to weigh on the system. Productivity slows, but debt service remains high. That's when cracks begin to show. At this stage, internal conflicts tend to rise between rich and poor, urban and rural, private sector and state sector, and the central government typically responds by tightening control, which in turn stifles innovation and market dynamism. That's the transition from a free and competitive phase to a more rigid and fragile one. Externally, the country often finds itself facing growing friction with other powers. As it rises, it challenges the established order. Trade tensions, technological competition, and military posturing are common features. History shows us that this phase is often marked by geopolitical miscalculations. The rising power believes it has more leverage than it does. The existing powers feel threatened and begin to push back. This dynamic can lead to decoupling, sanctions, or even direct conflict. What's important to understand is that none of this is unique. We've seen similar patterns play out in the Dutch Empire, the British Empire, and even in the United States. The mistake most people make is treating the present as if it's entirely new, when in fact it's echoing the same structural dynamics we've seen many times before. It's not about ideology or personalities. It's about where we are in the long-term cycle. The reason the cycle repeats is because of human nature. In good times, people borrow and speculate more. They become overconfident. They assume that the growth they've experienced will continue indefinitely. But nothing grows forever. Eventually, the excesses of the boom years create the conditions for the bust. And when that bust comes, the question becomes, does the leadership have the tools, the wisdom, and the will to manage the transition peacefully? In China's case, the model that once worked so well, export-led growth, heavy infrastructure investment, and tight central control is now showing diminishing returns. Debt levels are historically high. Demographics are turning from tailwind to headwind, and the global environment has become more hostile. The cycle has turned. The challenge now is how the transition is managed. Will it be disorderly or deliberate? Will reforms be implemented or delayed? These are the critical questions of our time, and they can't be answered by short-term data or political slogans. They require deep understanding, historical perspective, and a brutally honest assessment of reality. Because the laws of cycles don't bend to willpower, they can only be respected and prepared for. The most dangerous moment in any cycle is when people believe the old rules no longer apply, but they always do. And they are playing out now. The only variable is how we choose to respond. One of the most common mistakes people make is assuming that debt problems happen all at once. But that's rarely how it works. In reality, they build slowly, almost invisibly, until they reach a point where they can no longer be ignored. What begins as a tool for growth eventually becomes a constraint. That's what we're witnessing now. The system becomes so burdened with obligations that it can no longer function efficiently, and the debt itself turns into the risk. Debt in itself is not a bad thing. In fact, when used productively, where the returns exceed the cost of borrowing, it accelerates development. But when too much borrowing is used to finance consumption or unproductive investments, it creates a future drag. That's what leads to a debt overhang. It's like an economy carrying a weight too large for its own momentum. It slows down, confidence starts to erode, and slowly it becomes more fragile than it appears on the surface. What we're seeing is the classic symptom of this stage in the long-term debt cycle. For years, the expansion of credit drove growth. Governments encouraged it, banks facilitated it, and the public participated willingly. Real estate became the primary vessel. It was considered safe, predictable, but it was also mispriced. And the more capital that flowed into property and speculative assets, the more distorted the system became. Eventually, you reach a point where cash flows can no longer service the debt that was taken on under the assumption of perpetual growth. That's when defaults begin. At first, they're isolated, a property developer here, a shadow bank there, but they reveal a more systemic problem, the illusion of solvency. Many institutions appear stable only because they're being propped up by rolling over debt or receiving implicit guarantees. Once those guarantees are questioned, trust breaks down, and when trust disappears in a highly leveraged system, everything else unravels quickly. The big challenge now is managing this debt overhang without causing a full-blown financial crisis. There are only 4 ways to reduce debt relative to income. You can cut spending, which causes economic contraction. You can restructure or default on the debt, which transfers the losses to lenders and erodes confidence. You can print money, which risks inflation and currency devaluation. Or you can grow your way out of it, which is ideal but often unrealistic when productivity is already declining. That's why the best path forward, historically, has been something called a beautiful deleveraging. It's when all 4 methods are used in a balanced way. Spending is cut modestly, debts are restructured selectively, monetary stimulus is applied carefully, and reforms are implemented to boost productivity. When done right, it allows the system to rebalance without triggering a collapse, but it requires coordination, transparency, and trust. 3 things that are often in short supply during times of economic stress. The difficulty is that political incentives don't always align with long-term solutions. Leaders want to avoid pain in the short term, so they postpone necessary adjustments. But delay doesn't eliminate the problem, it compounds it. That's the trap. Kicking the can down the road creates a false sense of security, while the structural imbalances grow larger and more dangerous. In the current environment, the situation is particularly delicate. There is too much debt relative to income, growth is slowing, demographics are deteriorating, and external pressures, from trade restrictions to capital flight, are reducing policy flexibility. That leaves little room for error. The wrong move could trigger a downward spiral, where falling asset prices and rising defaults reinforce each other. What's needed is a shift in mindset. Instead of pretending the problems are temporary or cosmetic, there has to be an honest recognition of the magnitude of the debt burden and a willingness to address it head on. That means accepting short-term discomfort in exchange for long-term sustainability. It means restructuring debts where necessary, allowing market forces to reprice risk, and using monetary policy not as a crutch but as a tool for transition. History shows that countries which face these moments with clarity and discipline tend to recover stronger, but those that ignore the warning signs usually suffer more severe consequences. The system always finds a way to rebalance. It's just a matter of whether that process is orderly or disorderly. In the end, it comes down to understanding that debt is not just a financial instrument. It's a reflection of choices made over time, and the consequences of those choices cannot be escaped, only managed. The window for a beautiful deleveraging is narrow, but it's still open. The question is whether it will be used wisely or wasted. When we look at the rise and fall of major powers, there's often an overlooked but powerful force at play: demographics. It's not as visible as GDP growth or trade balances, but over the long term, it's even more impactful. Because the engine of any economy is its people, the workers, the consumers, the innovators, the soldiers. And when that engine begins to slow, so does the momentum of the nation itself. For decades, rapid population growth and urbanization were key tailwinds behind development. A growing, young, and cheap labor force made it possible to scale manufacturing, build cities, and raise productivity. That phase, however, is over. What follows is a different set of dynamics: shrinking populations, aging societies, and a declining ratio of workers to retirees. These changes don't make headlines in the same way as market crashes or geopolitical tensions, but they erode economic vitality from within. The problem isn't just fewer people. It's the structure of the population. As birth rates fall and life expectancy rises, the proportion of older individuals in the population increases. This means that a smaller share of the population is generating income, while a larger share is drawing from public resources, pensions, healthcare, social support. That puts pressure on fiscal budgets, on social contracts, and on long-term stability. At the same time, a shrinking working-age population leads to labor shortages. This isn't just about factory workers. It's about engineers, doctors, researchers, teachers, human capital that drives innovation and sustains growth. Without enough young, skilled individuals entering the system, productivity gains slow, and when productivity slows, so does income growth. That makes it harder to service debt, invest in the future, or maintain global competitiveness. What makes the situation more fragile is that these demographic shifts are extremely hard to reverse. You can't turn around a population pyramid overnight. Policies that encourage birth, like subsidies, housing incentives, or parental leave, have had limited success in countries that have already undergone the transition to low fertility. Once people begin having fewer children and prioritize careers or individual freedom, those cultural patterns tend to stick. Education and upskilling can help to some extent. You can raise the productivity of a smaller workforce through better training and smarter use of technology. But that takes time, and during periods of economic stress, investment in education often gets cut. So the gap between what's needed and what's available tends to widen. There's also a psychological and behavioral dimension to consider. Societies that are aging tend to become more conservative, more risk-averse, and more focused on preserving what they have rather than building something new. That shift in mindset affects everything, from policymaking to entrepreneurship to capital allocation. It leads to stagnation, not transformation. On top of that, declining demographics can amplify inequality. When labor is scarce, capital tends to gain more power. But if those who hold capital are aging and risk-averse, they often invest in safe assets, real estate, government bonds, rather than innovation or startups. That further reduces the system's ability to regenerate itself. And when you combine demographic decline with other challenges, such as high debt, shrinking exports, or global decoupling, the result is a system that loses resilience. It becomes more vulnerable to shocks, both internal and external. The cushion that a young, growing population once provided is no longer there. What makes this even more concerning is the illusion of stability that often precedes demographic-driven stagnation. Economies may still look healthy on paper, asset prices may be high, consumption may appear steady, but the underlying momentum is fading. The long-term growth potential has already weakened, and by the time that becomes obvious, the policy options are more limited and more costly. In the grand cycles of history, demographic decline often marks the beginning of the plateau phase. It doesn't mean collapse is inevitable, but it does mean that the forces that once propelled growth can no longer be relied upon. If nothing changes, if productivity doesn't rise sharply, if institutions don't adapt, if innovation doesn't accelerate, then the decline becomes baked into the system. The challenge ahead is not just economic, it's strategic. Understanding the demographic headwinds is essential for making good decisions about education, immigration, healthcare, and retirement. It's also essential for investors, businesses, and policymakers who are trying to navigate an uncertain future. Because when momentum fades, what's left is discipline, foresight, and preparation. And those who recognize the shift early are the ones most likely to endure it. The strength of a country isn't just built on its resources, infrastructure, or even its population. Over the long term, it's shaped by the quality of its decision-making systems, how well a country governs itself, and how effectively it nurtures innovation. When a system becomes overly centralized, overly rigid, or disconnected from reality, it loses the adaptability required to deal with complex, changing conditions. That's when decline sets in, not all at once, but in subtle, compounding ways. Governance matters because it's the operating system of a nation. It determines how resources are allocated, how problems are solved, and how feedback loops function. In the early stages of a country's rise, governance tends to be pragmatic. Leaders experiment, iterate, listen to markets, respond to public needs. There's a strong connection between performance and legitimacy, but as success builds, the temptation to consolidate power grows. The system becomes more top-down. Decisions are made further from the ground, and dissent, once seen as a source of course correction, starts to be viewed as a threat. When power concentrates, information flows slow down. Leaders are increasingly shielded from bad news, data gets filtered, debate is muted, and over time, the system loses its ability to learn. That's a dangerous place to be in a world that's moving fast. Because the more complex a society becomes, the more important it is to have feedback mechanisms that are honest and responsive. Without them, even well-intentioned policies can lead to unintended consequences. This erosion of adaptability spills into the economy, particularly the innovation sector. Innovation doesn't thrive in environments that are overly controlled or fear-driven. It requires freedom to fail, openness to challenge assumptions, and an ecosystem that rewards creativity rather than conformity. When people begin to self-censor, when businesses are afraid to take risks, and when capital flows only to politically safe projects, the creative engine of the economy begins to slow. In dynamic economies, entrepreneurs experiment and compete to solve problems. In less dynamic ones, state direction replaces competition. That may seem efficient in the short run, especially in times of crisis, but over time it leads to misallocation of capital. Projects are funded not because they're the best ideas, but because they're aligned with official preferences. The result is a buildup of inefficiencies that reduce returns and suppress productivity. Trust also plays a crucial role. For a society to innovate, there has to be trust between the government and the people, between institutions and markets, between innovators and regulators. When that trust erodes, people start protecting themselves rather than building for the future. Talent leaves, investment slows, collaboration weakens, and the system becomes more fragile, even if it appears stable on the surface. Furthermore, as internal confidence wanes, external perceptions shift too. Investors, trade partners, and allies start to reassess risk. When a country appears to be closing itself off, becoming more opaque, or less consistent in its policies, capital becomes more cautious. And that's not just financial capital. It includes intellectual and human capital as well. The best minds often seek out places where ideas are rewarded, not restricted. One of the most common illusions is that strong control equals long-term stability. But history shows that rigidity, especially in large and complex systems, tends to break under pressure. Resilient systems are those that allow dissent, welcome criticism, and adapt quickly when mistakes are made. That requires a kind of humility in governance, an understanding that no single person or institution can get it right all the time. When innovation is stifled and governance becomes overly centralized, it creates a feedback loop of underperformance. Growth slows, youth lose optimism, social tensions rise, and rather than correcting course, the system often doubles down on control, making things worse. This isn't a failure of ideology, it's a failure of adaptability. The most effective leaders throughout history have been those who created environments where truth could be pursued openly, where feedback was welcomed, and where decisions were grounded in reality. That kind of governance isn't easy. It requires strength and vulnerability at the same time. But it's the only kind that consistently sustains prosperity in the face of uncertainty. When the goal shifts from solving problems to preserving appearances, the future is compromised. That's when governance stops serving progress and starts serving itself. And that's when the real cost begins, not in immediate collapse, but in the gradual erosion of the very things that once made success possible. This isn't doom porn, it's a pattern we've seen across centuries. China could still pivot, or it could stumble. What matters is whether Beijing acts with radical clarity, deleveraging, reforming, restoring trust.
Thank you very much. We have some very exciting news today.